Every puzzle has an answer.
After arriving at a Roman-style Colosseum and defeating a demon beast with 3 other failures, Subaru, now a child, having been transformed and physically weakened, must find a way to escape the arena. But escaping won't be easy. Every guard in the Colosseum commands witch beasts, just like the lion that took him hundreds of tries to defeat. Even if he manages to take down all of those creatures with the help of the other prisoners, it wouldn't matter because the Colosseum's owner, the governor, has a curse that activates the moment a revolt breaks out among the gladiators. As if that weren't enough, Subaru must also face off against an enemy backed by the second strongest person in the country. Welcome to Subaru Natsuki's Impossible Escape. Several days have passed since Natsuki Subaru arrived in this place. Since then, he's been talking to everyone in the Colosseum. Although it may have seemed like he was wasting time, he was actually gathering information from everyone that might help him escape. That's how he found out that one person had successfully escaped in the past. However, that escape was only possible under very specific and exceptional circumstances, so it's unlikely to happen again. Thanks to all the information he's gathered, Subaru now knows that he needs to access a control room that raises a bridge to the outside world. The problem? The room is heavily guarded and said to require a special key to open. For now, his goal is to keep looking for more information and, if possible, the key itself. But that wasn't the only thing on his mind. The country he was trapped in was on the brink of a major crisis. A war was about to break out, and several people close to him were going to be involved. He had to make sure he was outside by the time it happened. The Colosseum was completely cut off from the outside world, so news rarely reached them. The only updates came from new prisoners who arrived from time to time. But even then, there were no guarantees. One of the initiation rituals for new prisoners was to throw them into the arena against one of the witch beasts. Subaru knew that all too well. He had experienced it firsthand when he first arrived. So when he learned that a group of new prisoners had arrived, Subaru made a bold decision. After thinking it over, he deliberately caused trouble to be thrown into the arena with the newcomers for another beast battle. This way, he could ensure the newcomers' survival and, at the same time, learn what was happening in the outside world. However, Subaru knew he couldn't keep stalling. The time to escape had finally come. Subaru is talking with Hyain, a lizard man who was his first fighting partner. Hyain is grateful to Subaru for saving and helping the members of his race when they arrived at the Colosseum as slaves. They discuss the room located at the top of the Colosseum, but both emphasize that no one knows how to access it. Although Subaru's investigation revealed that the supposed curse is a bluff, he still needs to find a way to reach the mysterious room. He could potentially rally the prisoners and overpower Gustav and his guards. However, the governor, strict as he may be, had never been unfair or cruel to Subaru. Because of that, Subaru doesn't want to betray the kindness shown to him. He tried to win over some of the guards, but due to his growing influence within the Colosseum, they had become much more cautious around him, making it impossible to extract any useful information. After parting ways with Hyain, Subaru wandered through the facility and eventually reached the arena's entrance. It was locked, but next to it was another door that led to the deepest level of the entire place. Subaru knew the entire Colosseum was floating above a lake, so that door most likely led to the depths beneath the water. Whites, one of his allies, arrives and informs him that this is where they dispose of the bodies of those who fall in battle. The two get into a brief argument. The tattooed man suggests they solve everything through brute force, but Subaru immediately rejects the idea. His ally then says he knows who Subaru really is and is aware of his royal lineage, but he doesn't care about any of that. What matters to him is simply offering Subaru his strength. Subaru was confused by what Whites meant, but he thanked him anyway. Right after, they heard a sudden noise. The bridge was starting to rise. They both rushed to the top of the Colosseum. Tanza met them there and told Subaru that she had just confirmed the key was in Governor Gustav's possession. Whites once again brought up the option of using brute force, but Subaru reminded him that the governor could activate the curse at any moment and wipe them all out. Subaru and Tanza knew the part about the curse was a lie, but they decided not to share that information with anyone else. Suddenly, they saw an imperial carriage enter the premises. Sitting atop the vehicle was a dark-skinned woman with silver hair. Subaru recognized her instantly and hid immediately. The woman was Arakia, the second strongest person in the empire. She served the traitor who was currently leading the nation, making her an enemy. Even though she was still hundreds of meters away, Subaru didn't take any chances. Thankfully, he had taken cover because Whites had told him that the woman had turned to look straight at them. Subaru could come up with plans against mindless beasts, but he couldn't imagine any strategy that would work against the Empire's second most powerful warrior. Just then, Idra shows up and reports that he overheard the guards saying that the newcomers had arrived with a message from the imperial capital. Tanza tries to calm Subaru down, explaining that just because they're from the capital doesn't mean they're necessarily enemies. Subaru replies that he understands but can't help expecting the worst. After analyzing the situation, he concludes that nothing good could possibly come from this visit. The orders must have come directly from the false emperor, the traitor leading the nation, someone who wouldn't issue a command without a specific purpose. While he begins to plan a way to sneak into the carriage and escape, Hien asks him what he's going to do about the curse when the time comes to deal with it. Subaru reassures him, saying that he has an idea of how to stop the curse, but he'll need help to pull it off. Just as he finishes that sentence, he sees his allies collapse to the ground, blood pouring from their noses, mouths, and ears. He hears the thud of their bodies hitting the floor one by one. First Tanza, then Idra, then Hien, and finally Whites. He doesn't understand what's happening, and none of them can answer him anymore. Suddenly, a sharp screech rings in his ears, and searing pain overtakes his head. It feels as if his skull is about to split open. He forces himself to stay upright, trying to make sense of the situation as he stumbles forward, clinging to the walls for support. As he wanders the halls, he realizes it isn't just his group. Many others have fallen victim to whatever this is. He checks the common room, the mess hall, and the main hall, but everywhere he looks, he sees the same thing. Bodies lying lifeless and bloodied. Even the guards are dead. While he's still trying to piece together what's going on, a voice calls out to him, asking what he's doing there. It's Todd, his most dangerous enemy in the entire empire. Ever since he arrived in this nation, Subaru has had multiple run-ins with this man. Their paths have crossed time and again, and now they both hate each other. However, the last time Subaru saw Todd, he was in adult form. Therefore, Subaru wasn't sure if Todd would recognize him in his current childlike state. Todd looks at Subaru and says he smells like a scary guy he knows. Then he adds that it's surprising Subaru's still alive after everyone else dropped dead. But that doesn't matter. It's only a matter of time before Subaru dies too. Suddenly, Subaru feels something cold press against his throat. It's Todd's axe, ready to behead him at any second. Fearing that Todd might keep him alive for questioning, Subaru decides to end his own life before that happens to avoid the risk of his respawn point changing. He prepares to bite down on the deadly pill hidden between his teeth. However, Todd notices what he's hiding. After figuring out that it's a fast-acting poison, Todd gives Subaru a choice: die by the axe or swallow the pill. Todd only offers these options because he doesn't want to dirty his weapon. Realizing that time is running out, Subaru chooses the pill. As the intense pain floods through his body, Todd sneers at him, saying he's disgusting and wondering why someone willing to die wouldn't use a painless poison. Todd is taken aback when he realizes that the pill is torturous, not peaceful. As Subaru's body convulses and the agony intensifies, he begins to wonder why Todd's voice is growing more distant. Let's rewind to the moment when Whites tells Subaru that he knows about his connection to the Imperial family. But Subaru doesn't care. He screams while trying to spit out the poison that was in his body when he died, but it's not there. The narration pauses as we are brought into a flashback between Subaru and Old Man Null. Null was known as the Doctor of Gladiator Island, but he wasn't actually a doctor. He was given that title because he once treated a gladiator who had lost an arm many years ago, before Gustav took over as governor. He cleaned the wound and wrapped it in bandages. From that day on, people assumed he was a medical expert. The old man did what he could with his limited knowledge. No matter how self-taught he was, though, there was a hard limit to his capabilities. So when Subaru came to his lab asking for a pill that could cause death, Null couldn't make a painless one. All he could do was mix the most dangerous ingredients he had. Subaru felt guilty for lying to him. He told Null that he would use the pill against the beasts he fought in the arena, but he had actually made it for himself. After all, with his power acting strangely, it was safer to have a surefire way to return to the past because he might be sent back to a point where hope no longer existed if he died again. Little by little, Subaru was forgetting what it felt like to be a young adult. But even if those memories faded, he would never forget the bonds he had formed, or that he needed to value his life. In a way, he was grateful that the pill caused pain. If it had been painless, his foolish self would have been too quick to rely on it at the first sign of trouble. Subaru's save point was set just seconds before the bridge rose to welcome the guests. Due to his sudden scream and convulsion, Whites asked if he was okay. Subaru simply told him not to worry as he stood up, thinking to himself that, though this power was something he never asked for, it was still a power that only the son of Kenichi Natsuki could truly handle. After thinking things through, Subaru deduced the likely reasons for his enemy, Todd's, arrival. Subaru turned to Whites and asked for his strength. He sent Whites off with a clear request: stall the newcomers as much as possible. The scene shifts. Subaru is heading somewhere, deep in thought. He realizes that his save point has been pushed back 30 minutes into the past. That was the only time frame he had to act. Recalling the events that unfolded, he quickly realizes that it wasn't just the gladiators who died. Many of the guards were casualties too. He hadn't had time to confirm whether the beasts had succumbed as well. He wonders how Todd managed to survive. Had he taken some kind of antidote? Was he immune to the magic that caused the massacre? He wants to check on Secelis's and Arakia's status, but as he thought about them, he realized that he also needed to consider Governor Gustav's role in all of this. Could the disaster have been caused by the curse? The very curse that Subaru had deemed a hoax? As soon as he entertained that idea, however, he discarded it. Gustav wasn't an unjust man. Strict, yes, but never cruel. He had no reason to kill the prisoners or the guards. If anyone deserved punishment, it should have been Subaru for his growing defiance. But the most puzzling thing of all is this: why was Subaru able to resist the curse for so long? Was it because he was a child? That's impossible. Tanza had died. Had he done something different before he died? No. Whites died, and he had been doing the same thing. Could belonging to a different race delay the effect? That was unlikely, as Hyain and Idra had died at the same time. As these questions swirled through his head, Secelis appeared and casually asked if something was bothering him. Subaru suddenly remembers that he never saw Secelis among the bodies. Since Secelis was the strongest on the island, it was possible that he had caused the massacre. But maybe Subaru hadn't noticed because the poison had clouded his vision. The two talk. Secelis tells him that the newcomers weren't fresh gladiators. They were Imperial messengers. Subaru warns him that something terrible is about to happen. Rather than showing fear, Secelis grins in anticipation, correctly guessing that bloodshed is on the horizon. He'd been bored lately, after all. He tells Subaru that he's thankful he showed up at just the right time to ask for his help, thankful enough to offer him his strength. They need to put on a good show for the observers, he says. The beings beyond the stars who are always watching this world. But as soon as he finishes speaking, he raises his hand to wipe away the blood trickling from his nose. Subaru was too late. Again, the massacre had already begun. Secelis starts bleeding heavily from his nose and mouth. He turns to Subaru and asks if he can do anything to stop what's happening. Subaru tells him it doesn't matter right now. They need to focus on healing him. Secelis simply replies that this is the first time he has ever bled because of someone else. Subaru isn't shocked by this statement. What unsettles him more is Secelis's complete calmness. He asks if Secelis isn't afraid of dying. The boy simply replies, "People die, that's all." With that, his eyes stop moving. His body goes still. Subaru knew exactly what that meant. Suddenly, he starts coughing up blood. Death was coming for him too. He walked down the corridors, only to be met with the same scene. Dead bodies. He confirmed once again that Tanza and the others were gone. The only thing he could do for them now was close their eyes and wipe the blood from their faces. He regretted not warning them about the impending danger. He regretted not being there for them. He regretted leaving that little girl to die alone in a place where she trusted no one but him. How could he have forgotten such a simple, crucial detail? He saw that the guards had died as well, but at least he could now confirm that the beasts had fallen victim to this phenomenon too. Subaru made a bitter joke to himself. At least he was more resilient than they were in one way. His vision blurred more and more, and everything was stained red by the blood that soaked the halls. Feeling death's weight looming, he raised his middle finger toward the approaching agent of death. Then, from the direction in which he had made the gesture, someone spoke. "What's a kid doing in a place like this?" It was Todd. He was curious about how a child could have lasted this long. Subaru would have preferred to avoid him altogether and die in peace. However, deep down, he knew this meeting was inevitable. He decided to draw out as much information as he could from Todd. He approached, even though Todd was still armed. Now they were just a few steps apart, close enough that Todd could end Subaru's life with the slightest movement. Subaru started to consider what he should ask. Should he ask who was still alive? There was no point. Should he ask where Arakia was? Todd wouldn't answer that anyway. Should he ask what happened to Gustav? He was sure Todd wouldn't say a word, just like with the last question. As he formulated his question, Subaru ruled out poison gas as the cause. After all, the place where he had been with Secelis was constantly swept by strong winds. If that had been the case, the wind would have protected them. Then he heard the voice of Cecilus, the boy who should no longer be there. It was a hallucination. Moved by the boy's attitude, Subaru suddenly shouted in front of Todd, invoking the curse's rule. In that instant, he felt the tension in the air vanish, the doubt and caution. He felt it clearly when Todd drove his knife through his chest, striking all his vital points in one clean move. But just as quickly, Todd pulled the blade back. The force of the attack made blood rush up Subaru's throat like never before. He tried to bite down on the pill, but couldn't. He no longer had the strength. His failed attempt caused the pill to fall to the floor. On the verge of death, Subaru tried to speak, but Todd couldn't understand him. It was only when Subaru managed to clearly articulate his words that he revealed what had caused all this: the rule of the curse. The moment Todd heard that, he rushed to finish Subaru off. Through his own death, Subaru confirmed that the catastrophe was caused by a curse that shouldn't exist. The curse that Subaru had previously assumed to be fake was what had killed everyone in the area. He confirmed this when Todd reacted instinctively just before dying, after Subaru voiced his deduction. At the very least, his death had served to rule out the possibility that this was all caused by magic. But that raised another question. Why would Governor Gustav do all this? In the days leading up to the incident, the governor hadn't used the curse against Subaru, not even when he openly defied him. Could the conditions finally be right to dispose of Subaru and the gladiators? No, that was impossible. Gustav was a strict man, but a fair one. He wouldn't do something like that on a whim. However, until proven otherwise, Gustav was now the enemy. At least Subaru knew he could count on Cecilus, the strongest person on the island. As he was thinking this, Whites interrupted, pointing out that the ground was shaking. New guests had arrived at the Colosseum. Subaru wasn't surprised by the news. What really caught him off guard was something else entirely. The last time he died, the guests hadn't arrived yet, and the bridge was still closed. This time, however, he had returned at the moment the bridge began to rise. For the first time ever, Subaru's return by death time had decreased by 10 seconds. Subaru knows he could just scream and shut out everything happening around him, but that would put him in a position to lose everything, and that's not where he wants to be. Because of this, he can't and won't give up. What if he keeps dying and his return point shortens to just 1 second before his death? It's a question he doesn't want to answer, or even think about. Even after he was turned into a child, the Empire wasn't any kinder to him just because he looked cute. The scene shifts, and we now see Subaru and Hyain hiding in the corner of an office. Subaru had convinced his ally, a humanoid lizard, to accompany him to this place since he would soon rely on his ability to camouflage himself. Subaru told him that something important was about to happen there and that it was crucial he didn't break his disguise. Just as he finished speaking, someone entered, declaring that he would allow them to say whatever they had come to say. It was Gustav, who greeted Arakia, the second strongest person in the Empire, and Todd, the most dangerous enemy Subaru had faced so far. Todd introduced himself and humbly claimed that he wasn't important and was only there on assignment. He said this while surveying the office, never taking his eyes off the corner of the room. Subaru desperately wished he would stop looking in that direction. After all, that was exactly where Subaru was hiding. The text doesn't explain it directly, but these symbols suddenly start appearing. They're not paragraph breaks. Rather, they indicate that Subaru has died. This will become clearer as the narration continues. Gustav asks if they are there to conduct an inspection. Todd introduces himself as serving under General Arakia and finally looks away from the corner where the protagonist was hiding. Thanks to the time that Subaru had asked Whites to buy for them, he and Hyain had managed to sneak into the governor's office. However, Subaru had made a mistake. He thought that the lizardmen just needed to be calm in body and mind to not be detected. In reality, he needed to stay completely still for the camouflage to work. Just before they entered, Subaru told him not to worry. He said he would be right by his side and that he just had to stay still. Those words might not have meant much coming from a scrawny little kid, but that scrawny little kid was the one who had saved his life and the lives of his friends. That's why, for the first time, his camouflage remained undetected. Gustav offers Arakia a seat, but she declines, saying she doesn't have much time. Then Todd asks for permission to present a letter that the Imperial Prime Minister had prepared for the governor. Subaru immediately knew it was bad news. After all, the Prime Minister had sided with the traitors and was already moving against those who stood with the protagonist. Todd asks Gustav to confirm whether the Emperor himself appointed him to oversee the island. Gustav confirms it. Todd then adds that he can't understand how someone like Gustav, someone from the same race as the national hero, ended up in charge of such a trivial task. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifts, thick with killing intent. Gustav speaks up, asking if Todd is questioning the Emperor's judgment. Sensing danger, Arakia moved beside her subordinate, ready to act. Even though Subaru lacked the strength or skill to stop her, he knew that Arakia could wipe out Gustav in an instant. However, it is Todd who stops her and apologizes, saying that the governor's anger is justified. The Divine General reminds Todd that he's not allowed to die, at least not until he fulfills the revenge he swore in the name of his fallen comrade. Subaru instantly realizes that this revenge story is just another one of Todd's filthy lies. Gustav accepts the apology, but warns him that everything could go up in flames if he chooses his words poorly again. Todd replies that the reason behind his words didn't come from him. He then hands over the letter given to him by the Prime Minister. The letter states that, by imperial decree, the gladiators on the island are likely to incite conflict and that the elimination of all prisoners in the facility has been ordered. Todd spoke about taking the lives of hundreds of people as if he were just taking out the trash. Subaru couldn't stop the nausea from rising. He had already seen what was going to happen. He thought that if he couldn't stop it from being set in motion, nothing he did afterward would change the outcome, not even his ability to return from the dead. Todd continued talking, claiming that it was an order from the Emperor, conveyed through the minister. He added that the capital didn't distrust Gustav's work, but rather, they wanted to eliminate a potential threat at its root. Gustav replied that, in recent years, efforts had been made to improve the living conditions of the average gladiator and to train them in body and spirit, all to shape them into loyal soldiers of the Empire. Subaru thought he detected a hint of pride in Gustav's voice, but Arakia quickly cut him off, asking if that was all and if he was finally done talking. Subaru wanted to shut her up for saying something so insensitive in front of the governor, but before he could, Todd spoke up. He said he'd heard that another Divine General had left behind a tool that could activate the island's curse and make fulfilling the purpose of their visit all too easy. The governor confirmed that it was possible. Todd responded affirmatively, saying that, in that case, things would move quickly. Afterward, Gustav would have to accompany them to the capital while they acquired new gladiators. Subaru heard this and knew he had to act soon. Once the curse was activated, there would be no turning back. As he tried to figure out the best way to intervene, someone spoke up. "I refuse," said the governor. Even though Subaru was still in hiding, he could feel it, a sudden and drastic drop in the temperature, one that hadn't occurred even when the Emperor's former decree was questioned earlier. Todd asked if he hadn't understood what was written in the letter. He even questioned whether Gustav thought the decree was a forgery. Gustav replied that he understood perfectly well that it was an authentic order, but when asked why he wouldn't comply with the Emperor's directive, Gustav said that he had previously received a different order from the same Emperor to educate the gladiators in body and spirit so they could serve the Empire in its greatest time of need. Gustav added that the Emperor had told him never to abandon that task, even if he were to receive a new command that contradicted it. Those were the words that Gustav had heard long ago from Emperor Vincent Valaquia himself, and he intended to follow them to the letter. Todd asked if Gustav intended to disobey the current order based on an old one. Gustav replied that even though he didn't fully understand the reason behind Emperor Vincent Valaquia's unusual mission, that didn't change the fact that he now knew exactly what he had to do. Then Todd stood up and told Arakia that the negotiations were over. Immediately afterward, Gustav rose to his feet and lifted the desk in front of him with both arms, a desk that Subaru estimated to weigh at least 100 kilograms. Before he could throw it, however, Arakia raised her wooden wand and cast a water spell that instantly decapitated the governor. A moment later, the governor's body collapsed and let go of the desk he had lifted. Todd mocked him, saying that all men from the multi-armed tribe were the same. He added that, instead of extra arms, they should have been born with extra heads. Maybe then they would be more useful. He then told Arakia that she didn't need to use so much water in her spell, and that a much smaller amount would have been enough. Still, he advised her to use fire magic next time, especially when dealing with large crowds. As he spoke, he began dissecting Gustav's body. Witnessing the scene made Subaru feel sick to his stomach. He couldn't stop thinking about all the times Todd had killed him, and how his own body might have been subjected to the same treatment. Suddenly, he heard Todd say, "Found it." A moment later, Todd pulled a black orb out of Gustav's body. He said it was the curse tool, the very object meant to fulfill the mission they had been sent to carry out. He told Gustav's corpse that he was a fool for thinking he could compete against a monster like Arakia, and said his final act of resistance had been pointless. Subaru believed that wasn't true, that Todd was the only real monster here, and that's exactly why he couldn't let Todd get his hands on the black orb. Taking advantage of the moment when Todd turned around to clean his tools with water, leaving the orb on the desk, Subaru emerged from the shadows and snatched it. Startled by the sudden movement, Todd reacted immediately, but before he could do anything, Subaru shouted, ordering someone to blow up the room. At that threat, Arakaya instinctively moved to shield Todd and prepared to strike anyone who came through the door, but no one showed up. Todd quickly realized it had been an empty bluff, but it only took him a second to figure it out. That second was all Heian needed. The lizard man grabbed Subaru and hurled himself through the window with full force, shattering the glass and plummeting into the void below. They had just barely escaped before a powerful burst of water shot out through the same window. Arakaya confirmed that their enemies had vanished. Todd ordered him to go after them while he took care of other matters. As his ally left, Subaru's enemy clicked his tongue in annoyance at the unforeseen turn of events. He muttered that the boy reeked of a disgusting stench. The point of view briefly shifts to Subaru, and we learn how he had to consider every variable to ensure that the two monsters, Todd and Arakia, wouldn't notice him. We learn how he asked Tanza to scatter strong-smelling herbs along the path to the office. Meanwhile, while Whites distracted the newcomers, Subaru had Idra gather several gladiators to block the messenger's way to Gustav's office. Lastly, to secure an escape route, Subaru placed a sheet over the window in case he needed to make a quick exit. Now Subaru is descending through that same window, clinging tightly to the lizard man. The lizard man asks Subaru what they should do next. Knowing he couldn't outrun Arakaya, the second strongest person in the Empire, Subaru simply told him to hide in the garden bushes. This would also give Subaru a moment to think through his next move. Suddenly, Arakaya landed, leaping from the top of the building and touching down effortlessly from a height that had required Subaru and his companion to descend with extreme caution. Subaru prayed she wouldn't detect them. For some reason he couldn't understand. She began walking directly toward the corner of the bush where they were hiding. That's when 5 gladiators appeared. They had been nearby when the explosion went off in the governor's office. Subaru felt blessed. Surely the divine general would question them about what had happened, giving him a chance to escape. But then someone spoke out loud. It was Todd. He announced that the governor had been murdered by a black-haired boy and a lizardman, and declared that the island was now under the command of Divine General Arakaya. He ordered the guards to find and kill the culprits, and warned that anyone who didn't comply with the new orders would be wiped out by the island's curse. Subaru was desperate. It pained him to be blamed for the death of someone as just and honorable as Gustav. He was also certain that Gustav would never have wanted his killer to take his place. If he turned himself in, he knew they'd kill him first and ask questions later. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted when Todd pointed in his direction out of nowhere. Had he seen through his camouflage? Thankfully, no. Todd was pointing at the garden, but not at Subaru. He was pointing at the 5 gladiators who had gathered nearby. Then, his eyes met Arakia's. After pointing to the poor souls, Todd made a slicing gesture across his neck. Todd had just declared the start of the Sparka, a deadly event unique to this island. The moment it was announced, Arakaya caused the gladiators' heads to explode. The narration offers a graphic description of how each person's head was blown apart, a description I'll refrain from repeating due to obvious risks of demonetization. I hope you understand. Arakia finally understood what Todd meant when he said only a small amount of water was needed to blow someone's head off, because that was exactly how much she used to kill these last victims. The violent sounds drew the attention of nearby gladiators who were curious and confused. They asked Arakaya what was happening. She simply told them, "I don't talk to dead people." One by one, the gladiators of the island were slaughtered. The Jinanive Island massacre had begun. The mass murder continued at the hands of Arakia. The poor gladiators couldn't defend themselves, even if they tried. After all, they were up against someone who didn't take them seriously. Arakia probably didn't burn the island to ashes only because Todd forbade it. If she did, recovering the curse trigger that Subaru had stolen would be nearly impossible. To make matters worse, the guards unleashed all the demon beasts held in the facility. With their horns broken, the beasts obeyed their masters without hesitation. Those who escaped Arakia ended up being hunted down and killed by the monsters. Subaru was saddened to know that the guards, people he had once tried to connect with, were now desperately searching for him, trying to kill him. He understood, though. They were driven by fear. Fear that, If they didn't find him soon, Todd would activate the island's curse against them. As Subaru made his way toward the healing room, he overheard snippets of conversations. Some gladiators were searching for him to hand him over to the authorities, while others were focused solely on staying alive. Subaru no longer knew who he could trust. He realized that avoiding the Imperial messengers and the guards wasn't enough. He'd also have to watch out for the other gladiators. Despite all his efforts to stop it, the island was inching toward destruction. He finally reached the healing room, only to realize that the door had been smashed open. A sense of dread crept over him when he saw the corpse of a winged giant rat lying on the floor next to Tanza. Despite the fact that the creature had previously caused the protagonist no small amount of trouble, the girl had taken it down on her own. But next to the rat was the corpse of Old Man Null, the doctor who had treated Subaru's wounds and made the deadly pill. Part of his head had been eaten by the beast. It seemed Tanza hadn't arrived in time. Soon after, Idra and Whites joined them. Subaru was relieved that they were still alive, even in the midst of this chaos. Yet, he couldn't help but wish the situation didn't feel so hopeless. They asked him directly, had he really killed Gustav? Subaru firmly denied it and began explaining what had actually happened. But when he mentioned Todd, none of them knew who he was talking about. Subaru simply said that Todd was more dangerous than a Sin Archbishop. The room went silent at those words. They told him that he shouldn't make comparisons like that. Subaru responded that he had faced multiple archbishops before, and that was exactly why he was confident in his assessment of that soldier. Tanza replied that she wasn't surprised he had gone up against Sin archbishops. After all, that's the kind of person he was. Subaru wondered what she meant, but before he could think too much about it, the group began to debate their next move. Escape? It could be an option, but they didn't know where the key to the room was, even if they found it. Operating the mechanism to raise the bridge and crossing it would be challenging. Fight back? Impossible. Their opponent was the second strongest person in the entire empire. For a moment, Subaru considered fleeing with only his allies, accepting that it was the best outcome he could hope for. But then he rejected that idea. That wasn't the path the son of Kenichi Natsuki would choose. Remember, at this point, the protagonist has been turned into a child physically and mentally. Adult Subaru had already overcome the habit of comparing himself to his father's accomplishments. He had found his own answer to that struggle, but that adult Subaru had vanished. The novel makes it clear that this current Subaru is finding it harder and harder to recall his past. He is becoming more influenced by his childhood self than by the man he had become. That's why he's fallen into this line of thinking. This version of him still lives in the shadow of his father and considers paths that the normal Subaru wouldn't even entertain. One possibility that Subaru considers is whether this is truly the best outcome he can achieve with his current power. Honestly, I love that this version of Subaru is approaching things from that angle because that unresolved complex will end up shifting the course of the story, as we're about to see. Then Hien tells Subaru to stop hiding it. Subaru doesn't understand, so Idra clarifies that he's talking about Subaru's father. Subaru replies that his father is just an ordinary office worker. However, Idra insists that they are talking about the Emperor of Wallachia, Vincent Wallachia. Hien then says he's heard the rumors brought in by the newcomers, that there's currently a war in the Empire between the Emperor and his illegitimate son over the throne. There are also whispers about the appearance of the illegitimate child. It's said that the heir to the crown is a boy with black hair and black eyes. Idra then asks Subaru directly, "Is it you? Are you the one from the rumors?" Subaru looks over at Whites, who reminds him that he doesn't care who Subaru is. He just wants to lend him his strength, no matter his bloodline. Finally, Subaru understands the meaning behind Whites' words from the beginning, and he's truly grateful. His allies say they're convinced he's the Emperor's illegitimate son. They believe it because, despite his young age, Subaru has demonstrated strong leadership and survival instincts. Subaru remains silent. He knows he's not the Emperor's son. If he's made it this far, it's thanks to his own power. He then turns to Tanza and asks why she didn't try to stop the rumor, but she says she's confirmed it as well. She then reveals that she once saw the Emperor in the city of Chaos Flame alongside a black-haired woman. What Tanza doesn't know, and it wouldn't make sense to explain right now, is that the woman she saw wasn't Subaru's mother as she believes. In truth, it was Subaru himself, disguised during a military operation. Since he was transformed into a child immediately after the mission, she mistakenly believes the child in front of her is the son of that woman and the Emperor. Subaru asks Idra what's so important about him being the Emperor's son. Idra replies that there's currently an internal conflict in the Empire, led by the Emperor against his rebellious son's army. That rebellious son is none other than Natsuki Subaru. Subaru ponders this information and swiftly concludes that it's a ruse, a facade designed to obscure the truth. The real war is between the betrayed emperor and the false emperor currently on the throne. He deduces that Vincent Valaquia must have deliberately spread this rumor as a way to provide Subaru with a tool to use to reach him before the final battle. Subaru curses the emperor for using such a tactic and is stunned by how accurately he was able to foresee all of this. He suddenly falls silent, bringing a hand to his mouth. His companions remain quiet, waiting for him to speak. The text describes how the sounds of the massacre can still be heard in the background, until Tanza breaks the silence and asks what they're going to do. But Subaru stops her. In that moment, he resolves to do what's expected of him. The scene shifts to Todd's perspective. He is now in the former governor's office. He senses that something bad is about to happen, and he becomes even more certain of this as he watches things unfold slowly. He's thankful that he didn't order Arakaya to burn everything down. Searching for the Black Sphere in those conditions would have been difficult. Cursing his luck, he thinks back to the moment he saved Arakaya after she was defeated by Priscilla. He regrets it now because he had hoped that act would get him reassigned far away from this place. However, because he'd lied and claimed he'd rescued Arakia to avenge a fallen comrade, the general brought him along so she could help him with his mission. He curses the memory of his dead friend, saying that even in death, he's still a burden. Todd then reflects on the situation and on the child with the foul stench. He says he's always thought of ways to kill stronger opponents, but he's never had to think about killing a child. Now that he's turned the entire island against the child, it's only a matter of time before someone finds him. Suddenly, the two guards with him start to question whether it's necessary to turn the entire island upside down over a single child. Todd reminds them that they're only not rotting in the same cells as the gladiators because of their uniforms. They're no better than the criminals who came here. They're scum too, and they're only alive because of their roles. Todd reflects on how he doesn't care whether the Empire changes or collapses from this civil war. All he wants is to go home and protect his fiancée. Lost in thought, he recalls crossing paths with a black-haired boy beloved by the god of war who always managed to foil his plans, Subaru. Todd thinks that if this boy ends up leading an army against the Empire, he'll have no choice but to flee with his lover. Just as he's pondering this possibility, something pulls him out of his daze. Someone who isn't a guard speaks to him. It's the boy who escaped the office. He's returned with a strange group of companions. A tattooed man, a hippie, a lizard man, and a reindeer girl. Todd questions how the kid managed to get there. He doubts the boy has allies strong enough to fight their way into the office. But then the boy speaks. He tells Todd not only to surrender, but also to call off the woman. Todd tells Subaru that he has no reason to listen to him. Subaru then pulls out the curse sphere. The guards panic and reconsider their position in the fight. Todd immediately tries to calm them down, saying the kid doesn't know how to use the sphere and is just bluffing. He tells them they'd be better off trusting him, a soldier sent from the imperial capital. However, he soon realizes that his words aren't enough to convince them. It's as if they know something he doesn't. That's when the reindeer girl speaks up and clearly explains Subaru's situation. She says that the Empire is in a crisis, and the one responsible is the Emperor's son. She says this while presenting the boy. Subaru. Todd couldn't believe the story, but the guards, who had witnessed Subaru's performance in the Colosseum and heard the rumors about his identity, were completely demoralized. When the girl asked them to switch sides, Todd immediately drew his axe and beheaded his former allies. Without hesitation, he kicked their heads towards Subaru and his group. Subaru didn't understand why he'd done this. Yes, it was a grotesque scene, but it wasn't something that would kill them. Then, something crashed through the corridor walls, destroying everything in its path. It obliterated the guards' heads and struck Subaru's entire group. The narration pauses briefly to tell us about Weitz's life. He lived in Glaracia, a city responsible for supplying weapons to the Empire. When Weitz became aware of the world around him, he realized that he didn't have parents. In order to survive, he began working odd jobs in the workshop where he had grown up just to have something to eat. He didn't choose the craft of weapon manufacturing for any particular reason. It was simply the trade of his hometown. Had the city been known for agriculture, he would have become a farmer. If they had specialized in something else, he would have done that instead. Weitz was a simple man who only wanted to live a quiet, normal life. He was born alone and expected to die alone, and he was fine with that. He kept to himself, working in silence and not bothering anyone. However, because he always kept to himself, people started to see him as antisocial and eerie. That was the beginning of the end. Soon after, materials began to go missing from the workshop where he worked, and he was accused of stealing them. Since Weitz had no one to defend or vouch for him, it was easy to blame him for the crime, even though he hadn't committed it. As punishment, tattoos were engraved on his arms. In that city, it was customary to mark criminals with such tattoos so that everyone could see who had committed crimes and who hadn't. Up until that point, Weitz hadn't lived an exceptional life, but at least it had been normal. After that sentence of social death, however, that normalcy was gone. He was fired and couldn't get another job. Trying to cover up the tattoos in a hot town would only make people suspicious of him. Driven by the need to eat, Weitz was eventually forced to steal. Ultimately, he committed the very crimes he had once been falsely accused of. Curiously, even after falling into disgrace, he never managed to find someone to truly connect with. Eventually, he stopped caring about that. So long as he could survive, that was enough. Time passed, and with it, his crimes increased. The tattoos that once covered only his arms now covered his entire body. According to the laws of his hometown, he was no longer considered human. He had become something far less than human. Since he had nothing left to lose, he did something before being expelled and sent to Gladiator Island. One day, he found out who had falsely accused him of theft. That person had been the real culprit all along and had framed him to save himself. Fueled by rage, Weitz went after the man. He beat him down until the man was in tears and then tore off one of his ears. Guards had to restrain him, and when they reviewed his record, they decided to send him to the island for criminals. By then, Weitz no longer cared. He was willing to lie, cheat, and kill anyone if it meant survival. At least that's what he told himself. But deep down, all he really wanted was
ワイツ、剣を取れ。お前が頼りだ。
was to be treated like a normal person. We return to the present. Aware that something would attack them from the side, Subaru orders Weitz to intercept the head that Todd had kicked toward them with his sword. He could have asked Tanza, but despite her superhuman strength, she was still a child, and he didn't want to traumatize her. So he relied on Weitz. The moment Weitz responded to the flying head with his sword, the walls behind him shattered. A flying demon beast had arrived, tearing through the corridor where they stood. It looked as if it had been aiming for the severed head of the guard. Now, Weitz was completely isolated, face to face with Todd, a man who hadn't flinched when he learned that Subaru was the Emperor's son. Weitz knew Todd was dangerous, someone he could never afford to let his guard down around. That's why he kept his eyes on Todd, even as flying debris from the beast's sudden arrival struck him, fragments of the shattered walls hitting his body. Preparing to fight, Weitz chose to use the hand on which his first criminal tattoo had been marked. Todd immediately swung his axe to behead him. Weitz hardened his left arm and held it out horizontally, bracing to block the full impact of the incoming blade. The strike obliterated the entire left side of his body, even though he had closed the distance to Todd in an attempt to lessen the force of the swing. Weitz could attempt such a reckless tactic because he had always had the potential to be more than average. He just never had the opportunity or desire to show what he was truly made of. At least, not until now. Not until he met a child even more reckless than himself. Determined to counterattack the axe-wielding man, Weitz swung his right arm to punch him, but Todd vanished from his field of vision in that instant. The next moment, his right eye's vision widened, only to be consumed by darkness. It was as if something had crushed that entire side of his face. Suddenly, he heard someone call out to him. He turned slowly and saw that his companions had managed to avoid the beast's attack. At the same time, he saw the axe-wielding man finish off the creature by severing its head. Weitz was surprised by how genuinely happy he was that everyone was safe. His left arm throbbed with pain, and for some reason he couldn't understand. The right side of his face ached as well. He used the pain to keep himself from blacking out, though it did little to stop the feeling that his consciousness was slipping away. With his last bit of strength, he finally realized what he had always longed for deep down. Even though he had always claimed he didn't care about being ignored, he had always wanted to be treated like a normal person. He had always wanted someone to believe in him. Looking at Subaru one last time, he smiled and said that it was the first time anyone had ever told him they believed in him. Then, the strength left his limbs, and he collapsed onto the cold, hard floor of the Colosseum. somewhere in the background, someone screamed and wept for him without pause. Hearing that made him deeply, terribly happy for some reason. Subaru watched as Whites' body went limp and fell to the ground. He wanted to run to him and help him, but he was stopped halfway there by a pair of small arms. It was Tanza. Then the narration cut in to describe how the floor beneath Whites' body began to crack, shattered by the massive weight of a frog-shaped demon that had landed on top of him. The creature's bulk caused the entire section of the floor to collapse, pulling Whites' body down with it. His crushed body fell into the depths alongside the beast. Subaru could only cry out his name again. Just as he prepared to go after Whites, Todd appeared. Completely unfazed by the situation, Todd casually explained that when a demon beast's horn is broken, the beast obeys the person who broke it. However, it will always harbor resentment and devour that person at the first opportunity. This explained all the irregularities they had seen so far, but Subaru didn't care about this trivia. He only cared about Whites. Todd twisted the knife further by saying that Whites had died because he cared too much about his companions. Now, broken by guilt over Whites and the foolishness of confronting Todd unprepared, Subaru finally heard Todd say that this desperation was how a child his age should act. At that moment, Todd raised his axe and stepped forward, but Tanza stood in his way. She wasn't going to let him get any closer. Suddenly, Todd vanished from her sight and grabbed her by the thighs. He knew the girl was strong, but that meant nothing if she was thrown off the edge of the island. The narration explained how she was hurled into the void, flailing and desperately trying to grab onto anything. That's when Idra spoke up. She asked Todd if he'd lost his mind and reminded him that Subaru was the Emperor's son. But the axe-wielding man didn't care. He swung his weapon at Idra and would have hit him if Subaru hadn't pulled his ally out of the way just in time. Just as the two of them moved out of his range, Todd took the opportunity to deal with the lizard man who had been hiding nearby. His camouflage was so perfect that he had practically merged with the surrounding rubble. But that was useless, since Todd already knew exactly where he was. The narration then describes how Todd slashed at what seemed like empty space, and blood began to pour from that seemingly vacant spot. Hyayan was dead. Idra told Todd to fight him like a true warrior. Todd simply threw a knife into Hyayan's throat, replying that he wouldn't fight like a warrior because he was a soldier. Idra tried to pull the knife from his neck, but Todd followed up with an axe to the head, crushing Idra's skull. Idra's body fell beside Hyayan's. With only Subaru and Todd remaining, Todd asked if Subaru was really the Emperor's son. Subaru asked why he didn't just accept the truth. Todd said he would only bother thinking about whether that claim was true once things were firmly in his favor, like now. That way, he could weigh it properly and avoid making a mistake. Then he added that there was something else that had caught his interest. Subaru's name, Natsuki Schwartz, was oddly similar to that of an adult he had met just a few days ago. He also said that Subaru's scent reminded him of that man. Todd didn't know the truth yet, but just a few days ago, he and Subaru had clashed in another part of the country. Now, having crossed paths again, Subaru had been turned into a child. Then he adds that if this man is indeed his older brother, he would love to keep him as a bargaining chip for the next time they meet. Subaru decides to go along with the lie because he doesn't want to waste the lives that were sacrificed for him. He thinks of Gustav, Tanza, Whites, Idra, and Hyayan for a moment, and says he's surprised Todd knows his older brother. In response, Todd simply states that he doesn't like being manipulated. Without hesitation, he slams a knife straight into Subaru's heart with all his strength. The blow is so intense that it knocks the emergency pill from Subaru's molar. He can't die now, otherwise his allies' deaths would have been for nothing. So he pulls himself away from the scene as much as he can. But Todd presses his foot hard against Subaru's abdomen to stop him from moving and begins to count to 3. At the end of the count, Subaru raises his hands to shield himself from the strike, but the axe comes down anyway, severing the boy's hands and ending his life. Subaru had returned to an earlier moment in time, and he still remembered the feeling of his insides being torn apart by the axe's impact. However, he quickly confirmed that his body was intact at that moment. He raised his head and looked at the scene before him. He remained silent as he watched White slowly turn around and say that it was the first time someone had believed in him, only to collapse onto the cold floor of the Colosseum right after. Even if Subaru reached out his hand now, Whites could not be saved. He wasn't supposed to die. Subaru wasn't supposed to die either. Things should never have reached this save point. Yet the save point kept closing in, giving him less room to escape fate. The sound of approaching footsteps froze Subaru's heart. Todd and Arakia had arrived on the island, and Subaru knew he had to do everything in his power to stop them from starting a massacre. Despite his efforts, he couldn't stop it. it still wasn't enough to prevent the worst outcome. Subaru wasn't afraid of dying. What terrified him was the reality that would follow. A reality that could no longer be changed. Now that his save point had updated, he could no longer save everyone. He saw Whites' collapsed body. The man thanked him for believing in him just before Tanza stepped in to stop Subaru from getting any closer. The scene was repeating itself, exactly as he had witnessed it a minute ago. Suddenly, Subaru noticed the witch beast falling from the upper level. Realizing that its weight would crush Whites, Subaru pulled away from Tanza's hand and rushed toward his fallen comrade. He wanted to pull his friend's body out of the impact zone. If he could get him to the healing room and bandage his wounds, maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. That had to be enough, right? As that hope burned in his chest and his feet carried him forward at full speed, a voice rang out behind him, saying that he was weaker than expected. Then, something slammed into his head, and the world suddenly began to spin. In that dizzying moment, he caught a glimpse of what had struck him, the blood-stained edge of an axe. As the world continued to spin, he watched the body of a boy lose momentum and crumple to the ground. That's when he realized it was his own body. Where was his head now? It didn't matter. He had to help Whites. He had to help Whites. He had to help Whites. Just as the world had suddenly started spinning, it came to an abrupt stop. Subaru took a moment to recover from the wave of nausea. He once again heard his friend's voice, telling him that it was the first time someone had ever believed in him. He said this as blood poured from his left arm and right eye. This unchangeable reality struck Natsuki Subaru's soul once more, breaking it all over again. Ever since Subaru infiltrated the governor's office to learn his plans, he knew the moment would come when he could no longer save everyone from his save point. He knew this because he had died many times before while trying to sneak in and stay unnoticed. The first time he died, he could return to where the messengers from the capital had just arrived. However, once he began infiltrating the office, the save point shifted, locking him inside the room. With each death, he could feel ruin creeping ever closer. From the moment Gustav died, Subaru understood that he couldn't afford to die again. If he did, death would be final, and he would be the only one to blame. If he could fix everything without letting his allies die, there might still be a chance to save them. But that was just a fantasy. By now, the sheer number of times Subaru had died was proof enough that a future without more death was already out of reach. How many times had he died by now? Subaru asked himself this as he recalled how this current save point began with Tanza screaming as she was thrown into the void. Just as he finished that thought, he heard Hyane call out his name, right before Todd struck him with his axe. Due to his weakness, Subaru was in shock and failed to pull Idra out of the enemy's range. Now, Idra was dead too, lying in a corner next to Hyane. Todd looked at Subaru, preparing to ask if he was the Emperor's son. This time, Subaru interrupted, finishing the question for him. Todd remarked how creepy it was that Subaru could predict his words. Seeing that his enemy was being cautious, Subaru immediately told Todd that if he didn't want to die, he'd better not move. Then he pulled out the black orb, the one that could kill everyone present the moment it was activated. Todd tried to reason with him, but Subaru cut him off, saying that he was the only one allowed to speak. If Todd wanted to stay alive, he had to stay silent. Had he not heard him clearly? Todd looked like he was about to explode with rage. Instead, he simply said he understood and dropped his weapons to the ground. Subaru was taken aback by how easily Todd surrendered. Todd then commented on how strange Subaru was acting. Wasn't this exactly what he wanted? Subaru felt regret. He had chosen the easy route by pretending to be the Emperor's son. If he had used the black orb as a shield from the start, none of this would have happened. None of his friends would have been killed. Then, Todd asked him if he knew how to use the orb. Subaru hesitated for a moment, and that was all Todd needed to see through the bluff. In the blink of an eye, Todd kicked the orb out of Subaru's hand, sending it flying down the hallway. Subaru instinctively turned his head to follow the orb's path, but doing so in front of a deadly enemy was asking to die. He heard something rushing toward him with incredible force. As he braced himself for the end, he admitted one thing: there was no way he could stop Todd. A fool who lost everything trying to be a good man, only to become the target of ridicule. Those around Idra Masanga described him that way, as a man who lost the family business, ended up on the streets, and eventually became a slave. Idra lived in a small farming village in the northern part of the empire. His grandfather had been tasked with building the town's water wheel and grinding its grain. He then became in charge of running the local mill. Thanks to that, the Misanga family came to enjoy a great deal of economic prestige. Idra's grandfather taught his children the importance of conducting honest business and working hard to earn the trust of others. Both Idra's parents and Idra himself lived by that philosophy. It wasn't unusual for the Misangas to help the village during times of crisis, often taking on duties that should have fallen to the village chief. The Misangas never tried to monopolize their business. They shared as much as they could, which was far from the norm in the empire. A place where the strong crushed the weak. When Idra inherited the business, he made sure to continue those family traditions. One day, after a long day of work, he met a strange man at the town bar, a warrior who visited from time to time. The man told him stories about the world beyond the village. It was a world ruled by war, and, truth be told, it sounded thrilling. Until then, Idra had never seriously considered other possibilities for his life. Soon, however, he found himself daydreaming about becoming a noble warrior. However, he knew that was no longer an option. After all, a true warrior wouldn't waste his life as a boring village miller. Time passed, and the strange man eventually confessed that he had taken an interest in Idra's cousin. Idra welcomed the news and even arranged a meeting between them. Before long, he was paying for their wedding drinks. But a month later, the conspiracy began. The man accused the Misanga family of forging documents to exclude Idra's cousin from the family inheritance. Idra denied everything, of course, but he couldn't easily dispel the doubts that came with such a serious accusation. Then his father, who had already passed the mill down to him because he was ill, died. Not long after, his mother died as well, as if unable to bear life without her husband. Idra was devastated. Still, he was determined to clear his name and restore his family's honor. He believed the villagers would support him when the time came to testify. After all, the Misanga family had always stood up for them. However, when the trial arrived, no one answered his call for help. Idra swore he was innocent, but no one believed him. Even worse, someone had planted fake evidence in his home, making it seem like he was organizing a popular uprising against the village chief. The village lord stripped him of his property and inheritance. Idra was then sold into slavery and sent to Gladiator Island. In that place, where fighting for one's life was nothing more than a public spectacle, Idra felt his heart crumble and his soul rot. He chose to sink deeper into despair. Hadn't he suffered enough already? How could he stay motivated to work hard when he had given so much and received nothing in return? Everything he believed in was a lie. Everything he trusted had been a mistake. Everyone was just looking to take advantage of others and save themselves. If that was how the world worked, then there was nothing wrong with him doing the same. Idra was nothing. He was no one. Of course, no one would choose him. He had no training, no special skills that made him useful. Who would choose someone like him? Not even Idra would choose Idra. Who would choose Idra? Someone who was honest to the core. Was there anyone out there who would choose someone like that?
戦士になりたかったんだろ、イドラ。だったら今だ。今がその時なんだよ。
The day he fell into despair was the very day he would be rewarded for living an honest life, even though he had already resigned himself to the belief that such a day would never come. Idra's head felt strange, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe. Although he could still feel his limbs, they felt oddly disconnected from the rest of his body. He remembered freezing in fear as he watched Whites die and Tanza get thrown into the void. In a way, it was ironic that his own cowardice had allowed him to outlive them. Was the humiliation he now felt in his chest the result of his inaction? The despair and regret overwhelming him in that moment far surpassed anything he had ever experienced, even greater than when his family business was taken from him. Idra reflected on his life and realized that he had lived a full and beautiful one. Perhaps it was that very life that had provoked the envy of the warrior who stole it all away. Either way, he knew he would never forgive that bastard. As he breathed heavily and his vision blurred, he heard Todd approach someone. He knew who Todd was heading toward, and he was grateful that the man's target was close by. Then, his vision cleared just enough to make out a small, bloodied child in rags dragging himself along the floor. Todd had already passed Idra, likely assuming he was dead. Maybe if Idra stayed down, the man with the axe would continue to ignore him and unintentionally spare his life. Then, maybe Idra could survive on his own. The man was closing in on the child, and the moment of choice had arrived. Would he choose to be cunning and strong, willing to do anything to survive? Or would he remain a foolishly honest man whom others could trust? What kind of person would he choose to be? As the boy's end approached, Idra pressed his face into the dirt. What could he possibly save by hiding his face like that? Then, He screamed and shouted, "No!" He forced his body to move, coughing up blood in the process. Unable to move his left arm, he used his right to clutch the man's body and try to bite him. Todd immediately said he knew the man was still alive. He dropped his axe, turned around, and drew a knife. He used the knife to slice off Idra's right arm. Blood from the severed arm painted Idra's vision red. Instead of succumbing to the pain, he screamed once more into the void and shouted, "Take him and get him out of here!" Todd instantly realized the lizard man was still alive. As he watched Subaru being dragged away by something invisible, Todd hurled his knife into the air. The knife didn't hit anyone, but for some reason, it stopped in midair just as Subaru disappeared from his sight. Left alone with Idra, Todd unleashed his fury. He drove an elbow into Idra's chest, slamming him into the ground. The force of the impact miraculously popped the bone in Idra's left hand back into place. That miracle wasn't alone. Idra had fallen right where Todd had dropped his axe. Idra grabbed the weapon, stood up, and looked at Todd once more. Todd asked if he really thought Subaru had escaped. Idra replied that that wasn't what he was thinking. He was really thinking about Hien, that good-hearted but cowardly lizard, and how he hadn't expected him to leave him alone with Todd. Idra thought he couldn't blame him. After all, even after everything he'd been through and all the misfortunes in his life, Idra had chosen to remain an honest man. In the end, people don't change so easily. When he arrived at the Colosseum, he tried to deceive those around him by pretending to be a warrior, but his lie was quickly exposed. He had forgotten that he needed to be honest and earn everyone's trust, even if it meant being mocked for being good. Idra Misanga knew that, at that moment, he was neither a warrior nor a liar. Gripping the axe with his blood-soaked left hand, he shouted, "I'm Idra Misanga, the miller's son." Todd simply replied that he'd never heard of that family. Mustering every last ounce of strength, Idra charged at the man with the emotionless face. He was glad Subaru hadn't let him become a liar the day they met. Subaru could barely stay conscious. He didn't know where he was, but he could tell that someone was carrying him. The person carrying him was rough, making the ride anything but comfortable. However, Subaru knew this wasn't the time to complain. He tried to muster the strength to lift himself up. When he looked at Hien, he realized he was a complete mess. He couldn't even maintain the appearance of blending in with his surroundings. In fact, every part of his body was poorly camouflaged. Suddenly, the person carrying him lost strength and collapsed. As a result, the boy fell hard onto the ground and broke a tooth. He turned to look at his companion and saw that he was in worse shape than he had imagined. Not only was Hien a wreck, but he also had a knife lodged deep in the center of his back. Idra's voice and Hien's breathing grew fainter. Soon, the two of them, along with White's, would be in a place he could never reach again. Then, out of nowhere, Hien spoke, saying how strange it all was. He'd once heard that life always chooses the prettiest flowers first, so he didn't understand why it would pick someone as messed up as him. He said this with great difficulty. It seemed like he'd lost so much blood that speaking was barely possible. Subaru begged him not to talk anymore as he dragged himself toward Hien. He wanted to stop him from speaking since every word clearly brought him pain. Desperate to keep him from choking on his own blood, he hurried toward him, but his body could only move at a turtle's pace. Suddenly, he heard Hien whisper that maybe it was better if he was the one to go first. By the time Subaru reached Hien's side, it was too late. Hien's body had returned to its normal color. Now that he could see him clearly, Subaru wondered if Hien had been dying when he ran to get him away from danger. He probably was. After all, Hien had been running with a large knife in his back, a broken arm, and blood pouring out of his body. They all died trying to save Subaru, yet he hadn't been able to save any of them. That made him just as responsible for their deaths as Todd was. Was it blood, tears, or snot dripping down his face? He no longer knew what was what, who he was, or what the answer was. He simply didn't understand anything anymore. Suddenly, someone spoke to him, startling him as he saw someone standing there while he lay dying on the ground. It was Cecilis, who said he was glad things were getting interesting. Subaru tried to turn and look at him, but couldn't even manage that. Cecilis told him not to strain himself so much on a battlefield where death could come at any moment. As he said this, he stepped into Subaru's field of vision. Subaru then noticed that Cecilis's small body was half burned, yet he still smiled, carefree as ever. At this point, it was safe to say that only the crazy ones remained on the island. The only survivors were Cecilis, Arakia, Todd, and Subaru. When the two boys met again, Cecilis cheerfully pointed out that Subaru looked like he'd had a rough time. He also remarked quite casually that that all of Subaru's companions seemed to be dead. When Subaru refused to accept this, Cecilis added that he was surprised Subaru hadn't realized it himself. Subaru was bitter. He couldn't understand how Cecilis had figured it out and yet spoke so lightly about something so painful. Cecilis continued talking, saying that even though Hyane had died, his final expression didn't look half bad. It was the face of someone who died fulfilling their duty. He said he envied that and hoped he could one day leave this world the same way. He added that he'd like to keep chatting, but he was currently in the middle of a battle against a silver-haired girl. He said he was glad someone had finally shown up to stand in the way of his goal of reaching the sword of the heavens. Subaru asked why he seemed to be enjoying all of this. Cecilis corrected him, saying that he wasn't laughing because he enjoyed the situation. He was enjoying the situation because he was laughing, and because he knew someone was watching them. A being from beyond the stars, the observers. Cecilis simply didn't want to embarrass himself in front of them. Besides, he was the protagonist of this story. Of course he'd act however he pleased. After all, the script should follow him, not the other way around. Subaru didn't understand most of the boy's rambling, but he couldn't help but agree with him, at least a little. Then Cecilis abruptly cut himself off, saying it looked like their chat was over. At that moment, Arakia appeared, no longer wearing her eye patch. The face that had once been devoid of emotion was now contorted with rage. The girl looked furious at Cecilis, but her anger didn't seem to stem from anything that had happened today. It felt like it came from something deeper. Casually waving his hand, Cecilis showed that he had stolen her eye patch. Before heading off to continue the fight, he told Subaru that he was free to either stay and burn to death or get moving. Suddenly, the girl's body ignited in flames, and wings sprouted from her back. The entire area around them started to catch fire. Even the remains of Hyane began to smolder. Cecilis showed an unusually serious side when he remarked that one shouldn't treat the remains of someone who had fulfilled their purpose this way. But then, just as quickly, he returned to his usual self and threw himself into battle. Arakia demanded to know why Cecilis looked the way he did, accusing him of toying with her. Cecilis had no idea what she was talking about. Frustrated, Arakia said she was tired of everyone hiding things from her. Cecilis fired back, asking her why she was making a face like someone who had been left behind. As Subaru fled, he caught a glimpse of Arakia merging with the flames and charging at Cecilis. At the same time, Cecilis transformed into a bolt of lightning and rushed to meet her head-on. Subaru was running, fleeing the scene. This wasn't a tactical retreat anymore. It was pure escape, a desperate attempt to survive. It was a life that had cost him his entire squad. Even though they had believed in him, he couldn't repay their trust by saving them. He cursed his own weakness and the fact that he couldn't be like Todd, someone who could accomplish his goals despite lacking authority. Because Subaru was incapable, people had died. Just as he began listing his shortcomings, he heard a noise. Fearing the worst, fearing it was Todd, Subaru turned toward the sound. It was Tanza. Her clothes were completely soaked. It looked like she had fallen into the surrounding lake. The way she walked made it clear that she was injured and had lost one of her horns. Considering the waters were filled with witch beasts, it wasn't surprising. She immediately expressed concern for him, saying she was relieved he was safe. However, the words had the opposite effect. Subaru's remaining strength gave out, and he collapsed to his knees. He was tired of falling short of everyone's expectations. Despite her own injuries, Tanza rushed toward him, asking him to get up. She also asked where Hein and Idra were. Subaru noticed she didn't mention whites. It made sense. He had died before she was separated from them. All Subaru could tell her was that they had died protecting him. Tanza understood and told him they needed to leave and find a place to hide. Subaru responded by saying it was pointless. They'd be found right away. The girl told him that their squad mates hadn't sacrificed their lives for that kind of resignation. Shaking her head, Tanza screamed in frustration at Subaru, who remained motionless. But her tearful plea didn't move him. Instead, it brought him a cold, twisted clarity. Indeed, Subaru, the one those three gladiators had risked their lives for, was utterly useless. In other words, he had let them die for nothing. He hadn't been able to meet their expectations. Even though he had gone so far as to lie and deceive them, it would have been better if they had never believed the lie that he was the Emperor's son. If only they hadn't believed it. Then, those three wouldn't have tried to die in his place. They risked everything for Natsuki Subaru, not the Emperor's heir. Now that he thought about it, he realized that he had deceived someone else with that same lie. He told Tanza that everything about him was fake, that he wasn't the Emperor's son. Yes, he was the son of a great man, but not the Emperor of the Empire. He braced himself, ready for Tanza to hate him, or maybe even kill him. Instead, though, the girl simply tried to help him up and walk beside him. She repeated that they needed to find a place to hide. Subaru asked if she'd heard what he just said. Tanza replied that she had, and repeated his words verbatim. Then she added that they would talk about it once they were safe. Subaru told her that he didn't understand. Since he wasn't the Emperor's son, there was no reason to help him. Therefore, there was simply no reason to save him. After all, it was pretending to be the Emperor's son that got those three killed. But the girl interrupted him and asked if he truly believed what he had just said. Did he really believe everything he had just said? Subaru pulled his hand away, but she stepped closer and looked him in the eyes as she repeated her question. Did he really think Whites, Idra, and Hyain risked their lives because of the lie he told at the beginning? The protagonist replied that of course they did it because he was the Emperor's son. Tanza said that while they all believed that, neither the tattooed man, the miller's son, nor the lizard man had risked their lives purely out of patriotism for the nation. If Subaru were truly the Emperor's illegitimate child, he would be known as an imperial prince. For those three, as people of the Empire, it would have been natural to try to protect him. But that only made sense if they felt deep devotion to the Empire. Why would they feel patriotic toward a nation that trampled their way of life? As a coward, Hyain tried to run and save himself. Whites, a weakling, fought to survive by outmaneuvering those around him. As a liar, Idra pretended to be someone he wasn't in order to gain control. None of them seemed like people he would naturally get along with. And yet, the three of them shared something in common. In the end, despite everything, those three risked their lives to protect Subaru. They shielded him. They gave him the chance to escape. Why? Apparently, they believed that Subaru was the Emperor's illegitimate son. But what if that hadn't been the case? As if reading his mind, Tanza asked him that very question. She said that all of this happened because he had become close to them. He had genuine conversations with them. He tried to understand each of them. He truly became close to them. As Tanza spoke, looking him straight in the eye, Subaru still couldn't grasp this. He kept wondering what he could have possibly done to make those three give their lives for his sake. He didn't understand the reasons Tanza listed because he had always believed that trying to understand others was natural, not special. Reaching out to them like that didn't seem extraordinary to him. Tanza told him that she understood how they felt because she had also been saved by Yorna, a divine general. She said she was certain they felt the same way about him, and that was why they were willing to die for him. Subaru felt like she was exaggerating. He had met Yorna and knew she was the kindest woman in the Empire. The very idea of comparing himself to her felt like a disgrace to who she was. But how did Hyain, Whites, and Idra see their relationship with him? Subaru knew more about them than they realized. He had seen Hyain's self-loathing, the false accusations against Whites, and Idra's downfall. Because of that, he said he wanted to save them. Tanza replied that he already had, but Subaru said he meant something else. Still, he began to wonder if maybe she was right. Maybe he had saved their hearts. However, saving their hearts alone wasn't enough. He wanted to save the hearts and bodies of those who had been kind to him. If he couldn't do that, then he wasn't worthy of being his father's son. No, that reason no longer mattered. What mattered now was what he wanted. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. He didn't want things to end this way. He refused to accept a conclusion where he couldn't save anyone. He couldn't accept an ending where everyone had to sacrifice themselves. He couldn't accept it. Subaru summed up his thoughts with a single phrase.
あなたに負けたくないです。
Then from behind him and emerging from the smoke appeared his sworn enemy wielding an axe. With indifference, the man said, I couldn't care less about winning or losing. Subaru had trouble recognizing Todd at first because he looked different. He had always seen Todd with a bandana on his head, but now it was gone and his orange hair hung loose. Todd complained that the boy had the luck of a demon, saying that the flames from the battle between the two monsters had slowed him down. Tanza told him not to take another step as she picked up a rock to throw at him. She might not be agile or in the best shape, but she could still use her superhuman strength to throw something that would hurt him. Todd complimented her, saying he was surprised she survived falling into the lake. He added that he wouldn't underestimate her resolve, as doing so might get him killed, as he held the spot where his bandana used to be. Subaru realized Idra's final attack must have torn the bandana from Todd's head. Tanza asked Todd what he was after. He simply said he wanted to go home. That's when Subaru cut in and said he would be the one talking from then on. His enemy replied that he had nothing to say to Subaru, who then asked if he was scared of a dying little boy. Surprisingly, Todd said yes. Of course he was afraid of a boy who, despite being on the verge of death, still acted as if he had a plan. Subaru thought Todd was the kind of man who tried to do everything alone, using others as tools. Subaru, on the other hand, genuinely cared for others and sought mutual benefit. People like Todd irritated Subaru, especially those who didn't care about their allies. That's why he told Todd that he wouldn't lose to him. Todd answered that he didn't care if Subaru won as long as he died in the end. The protagonist responded that if he lost, it wouldn't just be his loss, it would be the loss of the entire squad. He immediately dropped to his knees. While Todd kept his eyes fixed on Tanza, Subaru, using his last bit of strength, muttered, as he braced himself for what was about to happen. Tanza and Todd stood frozen and stunned by his words. In the past, whenever Subaru had said those words, breaking the taboo of his power, time would stop and shadows would appear to inflict unimaginable pain on him. But now, none of that happened. This was because the witch, or rather, the entity that governed his power, had lost contact with him. He remembered how his power had behaved strangely during the fight against Olbart, how it had failed him in his first Colosseum battle, and how it had spiraled out of control during this massacre. Those moments all had something in common, some discrepancy that Subaru couldn't explain but could definitely feel. Just as a fish wouldn't forget how to swim, Subaru hadn't forgotten how to use his authority. He was now certain that he had lost his connection to the witch, so he kept repeating those forbidden words, louder and louder. He didn't try to hide them from Tanza or Todd. He didn't hope that someone on the island would hear them. He was calling out to someone far above it all, someone who had always been with him. Subaru was reaching out to that someone who was always watching him, just as the Watchers had always watched Cecilus. It was this that had held him back from shouting at Cecilus when he talked about beings beyond the stars. Now more than ever, Subaru was sure the witch couldn't see him anymore. If she could see him, his save points would be filled with love, not despair. He continued speaking.
俺は死に戻りし顔してる。俺はここにいる。俺を見つけてくれ。虫のいい話なのはわかってる。でも、みんなを助けたいんだ。俺の、夏希、スバルの権能だけじゃ足りないんだ。だから、見つけてくれ。サテラ。
愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。愛してる。
Suddenly, the world lost all color and everything around him stopped, including Subaru, who could only watch out of the corner of his eye as someone approached and embraced him from behind. He heard whispered words of love in his ear. Once the witch settled against his back, she reached through his chest with her fingers. Not violently and without drawing blood, she sought to gently caress his heart. Now that she was finally where she wanted to be, Subaru thought that even if the world were consumed by this power, he would not be destroyed. Suddenly, time resumed. Todd and Tanza still couldn't grasp what Subaru meant when he said he can retun by death, but they didn't have time to dwell on it because out of nowhere, strange howls began echoing throughout the area. All the witch beasts in the area stopped what they were doing and began howling in unison, as if they had been practicing for this moment. Todd didn't understand why this was happening, but he deduced that Subaru was somehow the cause. Determined to put an end to it, he attacked. Without hesitation, Tanza used all her strength to hurl a rock at his chest. Todd raised his left arm to block it, dislocating his shoulder in the process. Just as he swung his axe down to cleave Tanza's small body, Subaru stepped in, pulling the girl out of harm's way and putting himself in her place. Todd expected to see the boy's head fly off, but instead, there was a dull thud, followed by a powerful impact. It was Todd who was sent flying through the air. He landed on his back, stunned, and found himself bleeding. His knees were too weak to hold him up. As he tried to make sense of what had just happened, Subaru told him, "Next time you get close, I'll blow your head off," and flipped him off. Never taking his eyes off Subaru, Todd slowly backed away and disappeared into the smoke. Subaru knew that Todd was at a disadvantage, so he trusted that he wouldn't return. Tanza instantly rushed to his aid, but despite running as fast as she couldn't stop Subaru from collapsing to the ground. You see, Subaru had been dying ever since he jumped from the top of the building with Hein. The fall shattered many of his bones, and using invisible providence overstimulated his brain, further damaging his already dying body. To make matters worse, he hadn't fully blocked Todd's axe. The blade had buried itself in his chest. Subaru had only been able to stand and make that final effort because his body had already given out. All that remained was a final act of resignation before death. When Tanza reached him, she couldn't find the words to speak through her tears, nor did she know what to say. Subaru pulled the black orb from his clothes. He knew it was useless. The world was ending soon. Still, He didn't want to leave her unprotected. With his last remaining strength, he told her that if she kept moving forward, she would eventually find Cecilis, who was likely fighting Arakia. He could tell she desperately wanted to say something, but he felt it wasn't necessary. After all, she was the one who had helped him remember that the only good thing about him was that he never gave up. Before dying, he told her that he would save everyone. Tanza may have thought those were just the words of a stubborn boy, but she didn't mock him. Instead, she told him that next time, they would definitely win. With that final resolve, Subaru Natsuki's life came to an end. The scene shifts, and we see Todd sitting bored in a carriage driven by a coachman while Arakaya stands guard on top. Todd thinks about how unfair it was that he only had a brief moment to reunite with his fiancée. He regrets lying about avenging his friend because now they're sending him to talk with the governor and deal with the gladiators. He had heard that all he needed to do was retrieve an orb that released a curse that killed any gladiator who tried to leave the island. Apparently, Groovy, one of the nation's divine generals and one of its strongest individuals, had created the curse. Since the lake was deep, all Todd had to do was toss the orb into the water. Within minutes, the curse would reach every marked gladiator. He just needed to convince the governor, and the job would be done. As they began crossing the bridge to the island, Arakaya remarked that something felt off. Todd saw that all the gladiators, guards, and even the governor were gathered at the entrance, waiting for them. Feeling that things were about to go very wrong, Todd told Arakia that they needed to turn back immediately. Trusting her subordinate's instincts, she obeyed without question. The only person unhappy about the sudden change of plans was the coachman, but a single sharp glare from Todd was enough to silence him and make him comply. It's said that if the coachman had hesitated even a second longer, Todd would have thrown him into the lake to be devoured by the witch beasts lurking within. On their way back down the path, Todd told Arakaya to prepare to attack the islanders if they tried anything. After all, the fact that they were waiting so openly had to mean that they were being led by someone truly terrifying. When Arakia asked if they couldn't just defeat that person with her strength, Todd replied that they couldn't beat this enemy, at least not today. Someone said they knew the people in the carriage would turn back, but they hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. After all, there was no way they were going to allow a massacre to unfold inside, which would have resulted in casualties on both sides. Subaru thought this to himself while Tanza reported that the messengers had already left. The girl expressed her relief that they hadn't ended up facing Arakia as an enemy. Subaru began gently patting her head. Looking at her unharmed body, he felt glad not to see her covered in wounds or with her horn broken. Thankfully, that hadn't happened in this world. Suddenly, Hyain said it wasn't the time for kids to be flirting with each other. Upon hearing this, Subaru immediately stopped patting Tanza's head and turned to look at Hyain with clear annoyance. Hyain glanced at his friends, hoping for support. However, Idra and White scolded him for bothering Subaru. After scolding the lizardman, his companions just laughed at the silly moment. Subaru watched the scene, thinking that it was fine if he was the only one who remembered what had happened. Lost in that thought, he noticed Idra remark that he had a strange look in his eyes. He replied that he was thinking about how far they'd come. When Whites asked about the next step in the plan, the governor finally arrived. Subaru asked the governor if he now believed in him after what had just happened. The governor responded that following the emperor's order to prepare the gladiators in case of an emergency, he had decided that the time for that emergency had come. For that reason, he was placing all the gladiators and guards in the facility, including himself, under Subaru's command. Whites protested, saying that the gladiators were following Subaru not because of Gustav's orders, but because they had chosen to. The governor replied that, regardless of that, they should remember he still held the cursed sphere, and with it, the means to make them obey Subaru. The story is narrated as Idra and Hyain step in to stop the two from fighting while Subaru looks at the hundreds of gladiators waiting for his orders. Suddenly, he decides it's time to recruit the final gladiator, at which point Cecilis appears. The boy asks why Subaru hasn't recruited him yet. Subaru simply replies that he wanted to see the impatient look on Cecilis's face. He adds that if Cecilis joins him, he'll work hard in return. Knowing Cecilis's personality, Subaru knew better than to show any desire for revenge when bringing him into the fold. That's why he waited until everything had calmed down, until it was time for the main actor to take the stage. Then, he tells Cecilis to stop calling him Basu. Knowing the boy would like the sound of the next word, Subaru tells him to start calling him boss instead. When Cecilis says he likes how that sounds, Subaru explains that it means leader. Now that his entire army is waiting for orders, Subaru declares that it's time to head to the capital and punch his father, the Emperor, in the face. Later, away from everyone else, he speaks privately with Tanza, the only girl who knows the truth behind the lie, and recalling how she once told him that, in a long-lost world, they would win next time. He tells her that, this time, victory is theirs. As the strongest existence, Natsuki Subaru will trample the Wallachian Empire. Before I end the video, I know there will be some lingering questions about this story, and I don't blame you. Although I tried to stay faithful to the original material, I had to make minor adjustments to adapt the narration to a video format. Consider this section a way to address things that might have seemed strange to some viewers. What happened at the end? Why did Subaru reset everything and avoid the final fight? As I mentioned in the video, Subaru's power had been malfunctioning more and more. Proof of this can be found in other stories I've narrated. His ability began to act in ways it never had before. He was aware that something was wrong, but couldn't figure out why, until his conversation with Cecilis and Tanza gave him the final clue. They hinted that the witch, the entity behind his power, had lost sight of him. That's why his return by death points were completely messed up. Now, at the end of the story, he re-establishes his connection with the witch, who sends him back to the last moment she saw him. The very first day Subaru arrived at the Colosseum. This is confirmed in the light novel. After he dies saying goodbye to Tanza, the next scene is Subaru arriving at the island and telling Cecilis that he has a feeling a great story is about to begin. Why is Gustav supporting the Emperor's son when he's trying to overthrow the Emperor Gustav is loyal to? Gustav knows Subaru is a bold child with great leadership qualities. He also knows Subaru is honest and upright to the core. After Subaru resets the loop by reconnecting with the witch, he organizes an uprising and talks with Gustav. They talk about everything, and after a long discussion, Subaru tells Gustav that if he joins the rebellion, Subaru will ensure that history remembers Gustav not as someone who betrayed Emperor Vincent Wallachia. Gustav only had the boy's word to go on, but he chose to believe in him, considering everything Subaru had done up to that point. In hindsight, Subaru was right. During the final war against another witch, the base of the good guys was only saved thanks to the gladiators who chose to follow Subaru. They protected the base from endless waves of zombies that besieged it while Subaru went off with the Emperor to confront the final villain. But that's a story I don't plan to cover. Thanks to the gladiators' defense of the stronghold, the Empire was able to preserve its last bastion during the War of Wallachia. Since Gustav trained those warriors, he will go down in history as one of the war's key figures. Why did I make a ReZero video when I said I wouldn't? I did say that I was burned out on ReZero, and that's still true. However, I also said that I would continue making shorts and doing live streams whenever there were new developments. To be honest, I don't even make the shorts myself anymore. My editor handles those. In the streams, I just review the latest updates before moving on to seasonal anime. While I am still burned out, there were a few topics I had put on hold, waiting for the right moment or motivation to address them. But if you'd like my motivation to return faster, a bit of financial support might do the trick. Don't judge me, guys. I need to save up for a new graphics card. When I launched the donation goals, we hit $35 on the very first day, and this was the video people chose, so I had to get to work on it. There's currently a new goal of $40, so if you'd like to support the release of another ReZero video, any donation will help. I'll personally update the amount received in the Drive link, which will also be in the description. I set the goal at $40 per video because I want to take my time working on other projects outside this universe. That's pretty much it. I don't know if anything is unclear, but I tried to answer the questions I thought might come up. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments, and I'll try to respond to everyone. However, I'd appreciate it if you read this part of the story before asking. Some things can be cleared up just by reading, and I'd like to focus on answering questions that really need an explanation. I want to thank all the channel members, but I want to give a much more special shout out to the donors from this tier. I'd like to thank Mansek, who told me he's been watching the channel for over a year now, and Juan, who was one of the main contributors to the funding goal for the video you just watched. I don't know Alejandro personally, but I'm sure he's an awesome guy. If you like the music in this video, I'll leave a link in the description to my Twitter account. There, you can find all the songs I used. Now tell me, what did you think of this story?